It's Versailles, 1682. You're King Louis XIV, and you fall in love with a little piece of land where a beautiful chateau is tucked away in the lush suburban forests of France. What starts out as a cozy hunting chateau becomes an all-inclusive city unto itself. From the outside looking in, Versailles seemed like Xanadu, but in reality, the living conditions were far from perfect. Today, we're going to find out what it was really like to live in the Palace of Versailles. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to Weird History and let us know what historic era you would like to hear more about. Now, let's voyage to this malice at the palace. Life at Versailles was a highly ritualized existence. Even the simple act of the king and queen getting dressed in the morning was a spectacle. During the lever, also known as an official awakening, high-ranking courtiers and royal family members had specific morning tasks, such as handing the king his clothes or holding a mirror. The king and queen also had an evening crew that did the process in reverse at the coucher, also known as the going-to-bed ceremony. About 100 people crowded into the royal bedchambers to witness these ceremonies, every day and every night. According to one courtier, nobles should be absent as little as possible at the king's lever, as well as at his bedtime ritual to better assert their presence at court. Louis XIV had strong aesthetics. Not only did he want his palace and its grounds to look perfect, he wanted the people he populated it with to dress with the same level of detail. Louis XIV required palace courtiers to wear certain clothes for specific days or occasions. For example, at dinner, men had to wear their hats at the table, and because the clothes of courtiers were so tight and elaborate, the meal was usually an uncomfortable affair. Louis XIV also tied fashion to French identity by supporting French textile industries. He was so committed to supporting French craftsmen that he once burned his son's clothes because they weren't made of French cloth. Millions of photos, videos, and paintings have been taken of the Palace of Versailles, but one thing no image has ever been able to capture: its stench. Plainly put, the palace smelled like feces, human feces. The thing is, plumbing wasn't really a thing at Versailles, where the king had his own fancy facilities, but the vast majority of nobles didn't have anything. All they had were chamber pots. The lack of hygienic areas to relieve full bladders or bowels meant courtiers did their business anywhere and everywhere, including the palace hallways. Yes, the palace literally smelled like shit, but people who lived there adapted by dousing themselves with perfume to mask the smell. At Versailles, Louis XIV basically transformed the nobility into a class of servants. He bestowed his mark of royal favor by inviting specific high-ranking courtiers and members of the royal family to perform certain tasks, like brushing his hair or holding a candle. Tasks were highly regimented, and no two individuals could perform the same job. King Louis XIV loved pets, especially dogs. He even owned several Great Pyrenees, which were bred in Spain. The palace dogs had an allowance of 1,446 livres a year, roughly $20,000 by modern standards, and royal bakers made treats for them every day. The king loved animals so much, he even established a royal menagerie at Versailles. The menagerie housed a wide variety of animals ranging from elephants to flamingos. But royal pets weren't the only animals at Versailles. It was common for courtiers to see animals, both feral and domesticated, just walking around the palace and its gardens like it was no big deal. You could see lions, tigers, hyenas, and bears. Oh my. That said, house cats were not welcomed at the palace. Sorry, cat people. As we mentioned, people didn't just visit the Palace of Versailles. A lot of people lived there. After all, the entire operation needed an entire service industry, and those people, roughly 10,000 nobles, government officials, and servants, all lived on the grounds. So it's no surprise that living quarters for all 10,000 of those people were at a premium. Of course, there was a pecking order in regards to which courtiers got the best rooms. Higher-ranking courtiers tended to have better rooms than lower-ranking ones. You also knew where you fell in rank by how close your quarters were to the king. The closer you were to the king's room, the tighter you were with his entourage. There was also a chance to get a bump to a room closer to the king, but it required a lot of politicking. Because the opportunity to serve the king was a coveted privilege, courtiers were always trying to climb socially in order to get better jobs. Before we move forward, it should be known that these better jobs were some of the most demeaning jobs ever. For example, doing something as mundane and relatively base as getting the king's chamber pot was considered a high honor. These were entry-level servant jobs, but if you got to be the king's piss boy, you were doing well for yourself. So with all that said, jockeying for these different jobs was a game of shady politics. Some jobs could be bought, while others were bestowed to courtiers who had entered the king or queen's good graces. Louis XIV had a good idea when he filled his courtiers' days at Versailles with daily tornadoes filled with pointless ceremonies, unnecessary rituals, and frivolous entertainment. His thinking was that if his higher-ranking courtiers' days were filled with busy work, they couldn't A. leave Versailles without the king's permission, or B. plot his demise. So courtiers spent their time doing things like attending parties or watching the king do things as mundane as eat or bathe. As fancy and proper as the palace seemed, there wasn't a whole lot of exclusion in regards to outsiders. Versailles grounds were actually open to nearby communities. It was common for tourists to stop by Versailles, and guards allowed their admittance to the palace on the condition they follow correct etiquette. Unfortunately, local peasants and area drifters took advantage of their proximity to Versailles by frequently disposing of their trash on the perimeter of the palace's grounds. Still, with thousands of courtiers schlepping around their filled chamber pots all over the palace, a little extra filth from the locals was easy to overlook. As a result of the king's open-door policy, the palace's population swelled with the number of visitors on any given day. Imagining the stench, no wonder the French's perfume industry advanced so rapidly. Because courtiers were present during every waking moment during the royal family's existence, they were eyewitnesses to some fairly intimate moments. We've already talked far too much about the king's fecal rituals, but let's not forget other moments of royal vulnerability, like giving birth. Furthering the line of succession was a matter of political consequence, so when a new prince or princess was about to arrive, the queen's labor became a grand spectacle. Courtiers got first-row seats to royal births, often jostling and elbowing each other for glimpses of the scene. Their gawking served a purpose. Courtiers were supposed to vouch for the new baby and affirm it hadn't been switched at birth. King Louis XIV also made his courtiers watch him and the queen eat. Mind you, these weren't special dinners or meals of significance. Louis just wanted an audience. In Versailles, virtually every aspect of Louis XIV was on view. The Grand Couvert was the dinner ceremony where the king and his family publicly took their meal in front of an audience. The opulent meal was usually meat-heavy and included such sides as pigeons, partridges, even truffled chickens. Courtiers and visitors who witnessed the ritual had to stand for the entire meal. Again, if the courtiers were too busy watching the king stuff roasted pigeon in his maw, they'd be too busy to overthrow his rule. Like most resorts, the Palace of Versailles was lovely when the weather was agreeable. During the sunnier season, its green, lush gardens, although offset by the smell of human waste and locals' trash, were majestic. But winters were rough. Winters mean courtiers were left freezing in their poorly insulated living quarters. The thing is, the palace was so large, fireplaces didn't heat rooms well. One visitor recalled in 1695, "It is so cold here that at the king's table, wine as well as water froze in the glasses." You think the Gatsbys threw great parties? Those shindigs were nothing compared to King Louis's bashes. Louis threw parties all the time, sometimes daily. As a matter of fact, one of the first large-scale entertainments at Versailles was the Delights of the Enchanted Island, a 6-day rager staged to celebrate the beginning of the building campaign for the Château de Versailles. The intention of this week-long party was to acquaint those involved, such as Louis's wife, his mother, his side pieces, his mistresses, and anyone else in his family, with the construction of the chateau. It was kind of like a let's meet the neighbors soiree to get things off on the right foot. With competitive races, lavish banquets, and theatricals by the popular playwright Molière, where he premiered La Princesse d'Alide and Tartuffe. In short, the Delights of the Enchanted Island party of 1664 was basically the Kentucky Derby, Thanksgiving dinner, and a Broadway performance all rolled into one giant party. The king was a baller. How would you feel about being a courtier at Versailles? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.